I watched my twin sister walk away smiling, the heavy oak courthouse doors swinging shut behind her with a dreadful final sound, sealing what she believed was my fate. She thought she had won everything, leaving me alone in the silent, dusty air of that room, but she missed the one detail that mattered, the judicial robes rustling beside me, and the judge, who leaned in and murmured 4 words that changed the entire universe I knew. My name is Naomi Keller, and for 38 years, my life has been defined not by the light I cast, but by the space I didn't occupy. I was the quiet twin, the one who agreed, the shadow to Audrey's formidable spotlight. That morning, February of 2024, in the Hennepin County Courthouse in Minneapolis, I wasn't fighting for money or inherited investments. I was fighting to prove I still existed, to finally claim a seat at a table that my own blood had systematically disassembled whenever I attempted to approach it. If you've ever felt like your voice was stolen, or that you were invisible to the people who should love you most, please hit the like button and subscribe right now. Because I'm going to show you how sometimes staying put is the ultimate victory, and how a lifetime of familial invalidation, a betrayal witnessed by the legal system, was dismantled not by shouting or confrontation, things I always feared, but by a quiet, bureaucratic authority recognizing the truth no one else dared to see. The air in that courtroom was dry, thick with the unspoken tension of dozens of lives waiting for irreversible decisions. The wooden benches were hard, worn smooth by generations of nervous fidgeting. The February cold permeated the stone walls, but inside, under the harsh fluorescent lights, there was only a nervous humidity. For everyone else, this was justice in process. For me, it felt like emotional surgery without anesthesia. Audrey, my twin sister, my shadow self, my inverse reflection, walked several paces ahead of me toward the main exit as the preliminary hearing concluded. Her posture was rigidly perfect, her head held high, framed by the impeccably tailored charcoal suit that screamed success and control. She carried herself with the air of a victor who found the competition beneath her notice. She didn't look back at me, not once, because in her mind I was already a footnote, an irrelevant detail that had been successfully managed and dispatched. Our history was written in the subtraction of presences. Our mother died when we were 15. It wasn't a slow illness, just a sudden, brutal subtraction. Our father, Richard Keller, never recovered. He didn't just grieve, he abdicated. He delegated the emotional scaffolding of our family entirely to Audrey. She was 15, but suddenly she was organizing the home, managing his moods, and, most crucially, curating the versions of reality that we were allowed to acknowledge. Audrey thrived on the control. She grew into the space left empty by grief, expanding her authority with every quiet decision she made. I, the other twin, learned the opposite lesson. How not to inconvenience anyone, how to be agreeable, how to minimize my needs until they were invisible. Audrey didn't scream or rage to establish dominance. She simply substituted people. When father needed a spokesperson, she spoke. When the house needed organization, she organized. When I tried to offer a differing opinion, she would look at me with that calm, disappointed expression, and I would inevitably fold, receding back into the safety of being the one who agreed. Years passed, decades almost. Our father eventually fell ill, requiring full-time care and, critically, someone to manage his declining finances and properties. By then, the role was irrevocably Audrey's. She assumed informal control of the entire family structure. When assets needed addressing, a medium-sized estate, some old investments, decisions about care, Audrey declared that I was simply not in the emotional condition to participate. And perhaps, on some days, she was right. My emotional condition was perpetually strained by the constant weight of feeling disposable, of believing that my primary value lay only in my conformity. I was introspective, highly empathetic, and possessed an acute, almost painful sense of emotional responsibility for everyone around me. My central fear was being discarded the moment I ceased being useful, and my deepest, most limiting belief was the quiet, paralyzing certainty that if I insisted on anything, on my rights, on my presence, on my opinion, I would lose everything, including the fragile connection I still had to my sister and my dying father. But the moment came, weeks before this cold morning in Minneapolis, when I finally questioned her about a specific investment move she'd made in Father's name, a move that felt reckless and perhaps self-serving. I remember the exact phrasing of her reply, delivered with the serene condescension only she could master. "Naomi," she had said, adjusting her designer glasses, "you have always been too weak for this. Don't worry your head. I'm handling it." Weak. It wasn't the first time, but it was the time that broke the seal. It wasn't the money that mattered, but the complete institutionalized invalidation. It was the moment I realized that I didn't want to beat her. I wanted to stop being systematically erased. It was after that conversation that I finally contacted a lawyer, an act of defiance that cost me days of crippling anxiety and sleepless nights, convinced I had just invited total familial ruin upon myself. And so, we arrived at the preliminary hearing in February. The proceedings were dry, focusing on legal precedents for asset management and the capacity of the current informal representative, Audrey. As the hearing progressed, I sat beside my lawyer, the picture of quiet resignation. Audrey, on the other hand, was magnetic. She spoke to Judge Rosen, a man known for his meticulous adherence to procedure, with an assured deference, presenting documentation that detailed her years of dedicated, tireless care and management. She carefully painted a picture of herself as the dutiful daughter, the organized mind, the stable force. She didn't have to overtly paint me as the unstable one. The contrast did the work for her. The narrative was simple. One competent twin, one fragile twin, and the competent one ensuring the fragile one wasn't burdened by complex decisions. But while I struggled internally with the urge to simply apologize and walk away, the other side of my psychology, the unique ability of observation, the precise, often painful memory, was cataloging everything. Audrey's arguments, while smooth, were riddled with tiny holes that only someone who had lived inside her controlled narrative for decades could spot. There were inconsistencies in the timeline of asset sales versus care needs. There were convenient gaps in communication records. I noticed how she avoided direct eye contact with the judge when confirming specific dates, a quick flick of her gaze toward her attorney instead. These were details invisible to the external observer, but screamingly obvious to the one who had spent a lifetime observing silently. My body was locked in a state of hypervigilance, the typical response of someone accustomed to navigating a volatile environment. My hands were clammy. I could feel the tension radiating off my spine, that familiar internal tremor that signaled I was far outside my comfort zone. All I wanted was for this to end, preferably without a massive explosion, even if it meant admitting defeat. I just wanted the right to exist in the room, to have my presence acknowledged, not to win the whole estate. The judge, Michael Rosen, a man whose face was etched with the weight of countless past judgments, had listened mostly impassively, occasionally interrupting with precise, pointed questions directed solely at Audrey and her counsel regarding procedural adherence and documentation completeness. Then, it happened. The preliminary arguments concluded. Judge Rosen gathered his files, stacking them meticulously, clearly preparing for a recess or an adjournment. Before he could make the official declaration of adjournment, before he could even signal a brief break, Audrey stood up. It was a premature, calculated movement, the ultimate microaggression of dismissal. She turned. Her eyes, identical to mine in shape but devoid of my usual anxiety, fixed on me across the expanse of the defense table. It was a look that contained a world of silent mockery and finality. Then she smiled. It wasn't a warm smile or a genuine one. It was a polished, absolute smile of victory and complete dismissal. It said, "I did this. I won. You are finished." And then she simply walked away. The doors swung open and swallowed her perfect silhouette. Slam. She didn't need to stay. She didn't need to wait for the legal formalities. She was making a statement. The proceedings were over for her, and she had confirmed her perceived dominance. She didn't need me, the court, or the judge's permission. She was the authority. I remained seated, paralyzed by the public cruelty of that exit. The air that rushed back into the room felt cold and vast. My breath hitched in my chest, a tight, painful knot. My lawyer was already gathering his own papers, preparing his consolation speech. I felt the familiar shame wash over me, the guilt that I had dared to challenge her, that I had been right about my deep-seated fear. I had insisted, and now I had lost everything. Not just the legal battle, but the final flimsy thread of sisterly connection. I focused on the worn grain of the wood table, trying desperately to control the hyperventilation threatening to overtake me. The noise of the court staff shuffling papers sounded deafeningly loud after Audrey's silent exit. It was in that moment, a moment of crushing absolute defeat, that Judge Rosen, instead of retreating to his chambers or addressing the attorneys, stepped down from the bench. He didn't approach my lawyer, he approached me. He moved with a quiet deliberation, his heavy robes barely rustling. He stopped right beside my chair, closer than was professionally appropriate. I could smell the faint scent of old paper and starch. My eyes, still focused on the grain of the table, darted up toward his shoes, then hesitantly to his face. His expression was serious, contemplative, and utterly unlike the detached judicial mask he had worn moments before. He leaned down slightly, positioning his mouth just close enough to my ear that his voice was an intimate, low rumble, audible only to me, maybe to my attorney, who froze mid-pack. He looked directly at the spot where Audrey had just disappeared. And then he whispered, "Naomi Keller," he murmured, the name sounding formal yet surprisingly empathetic on his tongue. He didn't offer a legal platitude or a dismissal. He simply acknowledged the brazen theater that had just occurred. He assessed the entire exchange, the years of pain packed into that arrogant smile, and the cold calculation of her retreat. He nodded once, slowly, thoughtfully, almost to himself, confirming an internal conclusion he had just reached. And then he delivered the 4 words that shattered the certainty of my failure and initiated the silent, bureaucratic redemption I desperately needed. "This changes everything." I stayed glued to the polished wooden bench, paralyzed, not by the shock of Audrey walking away, but by those 5 whispered words. "This changes everything." My breath hitched in my throat, a dry, painful catch. The air in the courtroom, already stale and heavy with the scent of old paper and nervous sweat, seemed to crystallize around me. I felt the heat rising in my face, a mixture of shame and a terrifying, unfamiliar hope. Shame, because I had just been publicly discarded by my own blood, but hope, because someone in a position of undeniable authority had seen it. Judge Michael Rosen, a man whose reputation was built on methodical, almost clinical detachment, had moved from the bench and now stood beside the witness rail, gathering stray files. His gaze, usually directed at the documents or the ceiling, was briefly, intensely focused on me. It was not a look of pity, which I would have instantly recoiled from, but one of professional concern overlaid with a sudden, unnerving clarity. "Ms. Keller," he said, his voice now slightly louder than the murmur, but still low enough that the bailiff sorting papers near the door remained oblivious. "Your sister assumed an air of finality here today, an attitude that suggests the court's formalities were mere obstacles to be navigated, rather than principles to be respected." I could only nod, mute. My long history of trying not to disrupt, not to contradict Audrey, made even the slightest movement feel like a seismic shift. "In the eyes of the law," he continued, carefully stacking 3 thick folders, "patterns matter. I am not speaking of the outcome of any single decision regarding your father's estate, but the pattern of decision-making, the consistent exclusion of one legitimate party, the reliance on sweeping statements of emotional incapacity rather than verifiable medical or legal documentation regarding your suitability to participate." His articulation of the truth was like a key, turning a lock I hadn't even known existed. Audrey's technique was never to shout, but to smoothly substitute reality with her own narrative. She didn't have to convince the world I was unfit. She just had to act as if I wasn't there, and eventually, everyone, including me, accepted the negative space I occupied. "I have perceived inconsistencies, Ms. Keller," the judge stated, tapping the folders. "Not necessarily fraud, that is a different standard, but a troubling pattern of what we term undue influence achieved through total social control within the family unit." My initial reaction, honed over decades of subservience, was to apologize for bothering him, to retreat. Maybe he's wrong. Maybe I am just overreacting. Maybe Audrey was right, and I am too emotional for this. This internal voice, the voice of the Hamia Luz who believed her purpose was to absorb the shadows, was almost deafening. But then I remembered Audrey's smile as she walked out, that calculated final triumph. It wasn't just a smile of victory, it was a smile of annihilation. It confirmed that for her, my absence was the desired outcome, the necessary prerequisite for her continued moral authority. I didn't want to cause trouble, I finally managed to whisper, the words tasting like dust. Judge Rosen looked at me squarely, his expression unreadable. Trouble, Ms. Keller, is not a judicial concern. Justice is. And justice requires scrutiny when one party is systematically erased from the process concerning their own life and lineage. He then delivered the tactical instructions that fundamentally shifted the landscape. He did not rule in my favor, nor did he reprimand Audrey publicly yet. His quiet redemption was a procedural one. I am vacating the informal agreements made since last quarter, he announced, the language sharp and official despite the low volume. I am scheduling a full compliance hearing in exactly 4 weeks. Your sister will be formally ordered to produce detailed documentation, including every decision regarding the transfer of investments, the rationale for liquidating certain assets, and certified copies of all medical consultations regarding your father's competence during that period. I need to see the paper trail, Ms. Keller, and the court requires proof that you, as a named inheritor, were appropriately consulted or given the opportunity to dissent. He paused, gathering his robe slightly. This is no longer a matter of opinion or family history. This is a demand for evidence of due process. And if that evidence is lacking, then yes, Ms. Keller, everything changes. He didn't wait for a response. He simply gave a curt nod to the bailiff, who now approached to guide me out. The physical act of leaving the courtroom was 1,000 times heavier than the act of entering. I walked out carrying not just my thin briefcase, but the terrifying weight of recognition. For the first time, a neutral authority had validated my internal experience. I was not crazy, I was not simply emotional, I had been deliberately sidelined. The following days were spent in a whirlwind of professional activity orchestrated by my lawyer, Mr. Henderson, a cautious man who had initially taken my case more out of pity than conviction. Even he seemed energized by the judge's unexpected move. Audrey, however, was furious, and her fury was silent and weaponized as always. She didn't call me. She didn't send an aggressive text. She sent a legal letter, formal and chillingly detached, stating that the court's new demands were an unnecessary burden caused by my unstable emotional state and vindictiveness, and that she was merely compiling the required paperwork to put an end to my destructive insistence. That was the essence of Audrey, framing the act of demanding accountability as the act of aggression. The real point of Virata, the true decision critical, began when the boxes arrived. Not just a folder, but 3 large gray file boxes delivered by courier to my lawyer's office, subsequently relayed to my small, quiet apartment. They contained years of documented control, financials, medical proxies, internal family memos written by Audrey regarding Naomi's participation limitations, and copies of correspondence with investment managers. I took the boxes home and placed them in the center of my dining table. They smelled faintly of dust and expensive copier paper, the bureaucratic scent of power. I was not a legal expert nor a financial analyst. I was just Naomi, the twin who watched, the Gemia Luz whose survival mechanism was quiet, precise observation, and an infallible memory for details no one else cared about. The first week was overwhelming. I sat surrounded by papers, the clock ticking towards the 4-week compliance hearing. Every document was a piece of my erasure, a tangible record of moments I hadn't been allowed to witness, decisions made in my name without my consent. I remember staring at a financial authorization dated 3 years prior, a date when father had been recently discharged from the hospital, heavily sedated. Audrey had managed to move a significant portion of his portfolio from a long-term bond fund, which father had established for both our futures, into a more volatile private equity vehicle managed by a friend of hers. The signature looked correct, but the date haunted me. I pulled out my old diary, the one full of insignificant daily entries that Audrey would have scorned as trivial. I always noted father's condition because I was the one who often sat with him in silence. February 14th, 3 years ago. My entry was brief. Dad slept through the whole afternoon, meds strong, called Audrey about the nurse schedule. She said not to worry about anything important today. And yet, that was the date stamped on the authorization. My heart began to pound, not from anger, but from a cold, frightening realization. It was not simple carelessness or error. It was deliberate manipulation of timing and documentation. The Audrey I knew did not operate sloppily. If she signed this on a day Father was incapacitated, she did it knowing she would never be questioned, because I never questioned her. This pattern repeated itself. A medical release waiving the requirement for 2 family members to be present during sensitive consultations, signed by Audrey alone, despite the fact that I lived 10 minutes closer to the facility. A series of letters to the wealth manager consistently referring to me as my sister Naomi, who unfortunately is too fragile to grasp these complexities. I wasn't just observing the documents. I was observing Audrey through the documents, seeing the machinery of her control laid bare. She hadn't just ignored me. She had actively constructed a paper prison around me, detailing my fictional weakness for the record. My passivity, my initial belief that, if I insist I will lose everything, had been her strongest ally. She knew I was unlikely to pursue legal action because my ingrained fear of confrontation was deeper than my desire for fairness. She had calculated the cost of my silence perfectly, but now, the judge's observation had changed the calculation. It wasn't my voice demanding the documents, it was the court's. I was merely the custodian of the evidence. I spent the next 2 weeks becoming the anti-Audrey. Silent, yes, but intensely focused. I used highlighters and sticky notes, marking every discrepancy, cross-referencing every date, relying on my meticulous, often self-invalidated memory. I wasn't just looking for proof of fraud. I was gathering evidence of my own exclusion. My determination wasn't fueled by a desire for vengeance, but by a desperate need for recognition. I wanted to look at those papers and say, I was here, I existed, I deserved to be present. When I finally took the annotated boxes back to Mr. Henderson, he spent an hour reading my precise notes. When he looked up, his face was pale. Naomi, he said, using my first name for the first time, you haven't just found discrepancies. You've established a methodical, intentional pattern of delegitimizing your role. The judge asked for compliance. You've delivered evidence of exclusion. The 4 weeks passed quickly, leading up to the second hearing. This time, I didn't walk into the Hennepin County Courthouse with the resigned posture of a supplicant. I walked in as a person holding verifiable facts, albeit facts that felt incredibly painful to hold. I saw Audrey immediately. She was dressed impeccably, her hair pulled back tightly, radiating the cold, organized confidence of someone who believed the legal setback was a momentary nuisance. But the smile was gone, replaced by a thin, brittle line of disdain. She hadn't expected the judge to take my claims seriously. She had expected a quick dismissal of the emotional twin. As she walked past me, she finally broke her silence, leaning in just enough so only I could hear. You have no idea, Naomi, the damage you're doing to Father's memory and reputation by dragging this petty jealousy into court. You will regret this. I promise you. Her threat was designed to trigger the old guilt, the fear that I was being selfish or destructive. But this time, my response was internal. It wasn't petty jealousy, Audrey. It was the simple demand to exist. I sat down at the defense table, waiting for the judge. The room was quieter this time. The tension was surgical, precise. When Judge Rosen entered and called the court to order, his movements were exactly the same as before. Controlled, detached, professional. Yet, I sensed a difference in the atmosphere, a gravity that wasn't there before. Audrey's lawyer began his defense by trying to minimize the new documentation as irrelevant, old history, and reiterated that Audrey had always acted in Father's best interest. He spoke of my recent and disruptive legal action as the true emotional impediment to the orderly settling of the estate. And then the judge interrupted him, not with a raised voice, but with a question that sliced through the practiced legal rhetoric, directing his attention immediately to the documented date of incapacity versus the date of the signed authorization. The judge wasn't interested in Audrey's performance. He was interested in Naomi's carefully highlighted timelines. The redemption was silent, authoritative, and devastatingly precise. He was using the weight of the institution to amplify the quiet facts I had uncovered. I hadn't needed to shout. I only needed to finally show up and have the right person notice I was present. The anticipation for the second definitive hearing was a heavy, dull ache in my chest, weeks of waiting under a suspended sentence of uncertainty. Audrey's confident smile on her walkout had served its purpose. It had solidified the fear that I might be fighting a phantom, a battle already lost in the eyes of the system. Yet, beneath the anxiety, I carried the quiet assurance of Judge Rosen's murmured words. "This changes everything." That phrase, whispered not to console, but as a realization of a crucial judicial pattern, had been the anchor I needed. When I entered the courtroom that final morning, the atmosphere was markedly different. It lacked the initial easy confidence of the first hearing. Audrey was already seated, her demeanor impeccably controlled, her suit sharper, her posture rigid. She wore the uniform of competence like armor, but the easy warmth, the false glow of the admired twin, was extinguished. She did not meet my gaze, focusing her entire being on the empty seat of the judge, projecting unwavering, dominant certainty. I sat down, recognizing her performance, but knowing now that the audience who truly mattered, the silent observer on the bench, had already seen behind the curtain. Judge Michael Rosen entered. He was all business, skipping the preamble. He spoke with a quiet solemnity that gave his words far more weight than any theatrical outburst could achieve. He began not by addressing Audrey's actions, but by reading from the findings of the independent financial review he had ordered. He detailed a sequence of asset shifts, investment choices, and specific disbursements made over the past 3 years. He was clinical, methodical, exposing a roadmap of decisions that, while individually justifiable in certain contexts, formed an undeniable pattern of systemic exclusion and benefit maximization for one specific party. He spent 10 minutes laying out the technical evidence, the cold facts proving the inconsistencies he had first sensed. It was the material manifestation of my lifelong erasure. He explained that in family and fiduciary law, the appearance of irregularity, particularly when combined with an existing pattern of emotional coercion, even if only inferred from testimony, required the court to act protectively. Then he looked up, placing the report aside. His gaze, calm and steady, settled directly on Audrey. "Ms. Audrey Keller," he stated, his voice clear and formal. "The court recognizes the difficulty of managing a complex estate under emotional stress. However, the evidence clearly demonstrates a consistent failure to uphold the fiduciary duty of fairness and transparency owed to Ms. Naomi Keller. Furthermore, the pattern of unilateral decisions, often justified by declaring Ms. Naomi Keller emotionally incapable, a claim unsupported by any professional medical evaluation, constitutes an active invalidation of her rights as an heir. The court cannot allow the systematic suppression of a party's legal standing, regardless of the perceived competence hierarchy established outside this room." He had used the exact word, invalidation. Not theft, not error, but invalidation. The slow, poisonous process of being told you are too weak, too emotional, too useless to be present, had been formally recognized by an authority beyond the family system. It was the most profound vindication I could have received. Audrey finally broke. It wasn't a sob or a yell. It was a silent, terrifying implosion. Her eyes, those eyes that had always held such calculated charm, narrowed into twin points of cold fury and disbelief. Her authority, her carefully constructed narrative of the responsible sister, was crumbling under the weight of judicial disinterest. She had always controlled the narrative. Now, a stranger was rewriting the final chapter. The judge continued, laying down the final order. The informal authority she had wielded for years was formally and immediately revoked. He did not grant me full control. He appointed a neutral, highly reputable third-party administrator for a minimum of 1 year. The core of his ruling, however, was this: all future financial and estate decisions would require the formal, verifiable consent of both Naomi Keller and Audrey Keller. "The court does not declare a victor in this familial dispute," Judge Rosen concluded, hitting the gavel once, the sound sharp and final. The court merely recognizes Ms. Naomi Keller as a legitimate, co-equal party, whose right to presence and participation is hereby restored. The silence that followed was absolute. Audrey stood up, her movements stiff, mechanical. She never looked at me. She exchanged a few clipped low words with her lawyer, gathered her sleek leather portfolio, and walked toward the doors. This time, there was no triumphant smile, no lingering glance designed to assert dominance. She simply left, vanishing behind the solid oak doors. It was a complete, silent withdrawal, the final, permanent severance of the bond. Her abandonment was not a spectacle designed to hurt, but a simple, cold refusal to occupy space where she was not the sole protagonist. I stayed seated, letting the realization wash over me. I wasn't a winner, but I was undeniably present. The judge's quiet commitment to substantive justice over formal appearance had pulled me back from the brink of erasure. In the weeks and months that followed, the legal dust settled slowly. There was no attempt at reconciliation from Audrey, no dramatic confrontation. She retreated entirely, communicating only through lawyers, maintaining a cold distance that spoke volumes. The control she had prized was gone, and without it, she had no use for the relationship. The emotional weight of our shared history, the painful bond of twinship, snapped cleanly. It was painful, but it was clean. Our father, still trapped in his cognitive twilight, remained blissfully unaware of the dramatic shift in power. Our mother, of course, remained eternally gone. But something fundamental in me had finally returned. I was thrust into the practical reality of estate administration, forced to interact with accountants, sign documents, and analyze budgets. Tasks Audrey had always insisted were beyond my delicate capacity. I made mistakes. I struggled with the jargon. But every single time I put my signature on a document, I felt a deep, visceral reclaiming of my sovereignty. I wasn't doing it perfectly, but I was doing it, and that was the entire point. I learned that showing up, consistently and imperfectly, was the antidote to decades of systematic invalidation. The true transformation, however, wasn't about the assets. It was about the architecture of my self-perception. I had spent so long defining myself by my tolerance for injustice, believing that if I fought back, I would lose the last vestige of family connection. Now I understood the insidious nature of that lie. I realized that abandonment doesn't happen when someone walks out the door. It starts much earlier, when they look at you and decide you don't deserve presence. Audrey had abandoned me long before that first smiling walkout. She abandoned my right to exist as an equal. The court process provided the essential, external validation I needed to internalize my own worth. Judge Rosen, with his quiet, almost accidental intervention, had not solved my internal conflict, but he had removed the external structure that enforced it. He had confirmed that my feeling of being erased was not paranoia. It was a reality enforced by patterns that the law could, and must, correct. His decision was the final, non-negotiable definition of my limits. Today, years later, the shadow of Audrey has receded. I no longer live fearing the judgment of my twin or the eventual discard. I administer my life, not based on controlling circumstances, but based on rigidly enforced limits. I have learned that claiming my voice, even if it disrupts the peace or ends a relationship, is the most fundamental act of self-preservation. My resilience was never rooted in my ability to silently absorb pain, but in my ability to finally observe the pattern, gather the facts, and trust that my subjective reality, my sense of being erased, was substantial enough to be validated by the objective truth of law. The greatest lesson I carry from that cold courthouse in Minneapolis is this: sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply remaining seated when everyone expects you to disappear. And sometimes, the most powerful affirmation of your worth is a quiet, factual decree from a neutral authority stating, simply and definitively, that your right to be present is absolute. This is a story rooted in the deeply personal, often invisible struggles of family invalidation and the quest for autonomy, inspired by countless experiences of individuals who have fought to reclaim their rightful place in their own narrative. While dramatized for this account, the emotional journey from total erasure to hard-won presence remains profoundly real. The trauma of being systematically invalidated can make you believe that your mere existence is a form of burden or selfishness. But the redemption lies in recognizing that your voice is a non-negotiable requirement for your life. If you have ever been told you are too sensitive or not strong enough to handle your own affairs, how did you begin the journey of reclaiming your competence? What was the moment, whether a quiet word, a significant event, or a personal realization, that changed everything for you? And what limits are you defining today to protect your presence? If this story resonated with the painful recognition of abandonment and the fierce struggle for validation, then show your support. Write the word existence in the comments below, letting me know you are here. Tell me where you are listening from, hit that like button, subscribe, and activate the notifications. Share this story with anyone who needs to hear that validation, when it finally arrives, makes the long, silent fight worth it. Thank you for walking this path with me.